I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today we'll be discussing the third chapter of the myth of Sisyphus, Absurd Creation. Section 3.1, Philosophy and Fiction. To be able to sustain oneself in the absurd, profound and constant thought is needed to continuously lend strength to one's conviction. The absurd person continues to live in the midst of absurdity, such as through stupid wars, but they are not living in contradiction, since they recognize that the world has absurd aspects. In continuing to live and fulfill whatever tasks they have set themselves, these tasks are tributes to their dignity, even if they know that in the big scheme of things they are of no significance. Whatever absurd circumstances our time brings us, such as war for Camus, it cannot be helped since the war cannot be avoided. The choice is to live or to perish. Even if there was no war, there would be some other absurdity. To live with absurdity without escaping through illusion, it is a question of breathing with it, of recognizing its lessons and recovering their flesh, writes Camus. We have to adapt to it. We can realize that there is something to be learned from living in the midst of absurdity and then go ahead and learn it. One thing that can preserve the absurd person is the satisfaction she derives from creation, specifically artistic creation. Camus quotes Nietzsche, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." Even after we resolve one pain, difficulty or trouble, another will soon arise. We can keep moving so as to forget or distract ourselves from them, or we can confront them. Camus thinks the absurd attitude is to remain open and receptive to everything. While people may commonly view the arts and artistic creation as a way to escape from reality, Camus' view is that art gives us a way to become conscious of our lives and to record its adventures by miming, repeating, and recreating our reality through artistic creation. The artist's point of departure is his brief life experience, from which he examines, enlarges, and enriches. However, the aim is not to explain and solve life's mysteries, but to experience and describe life. The heart learns thus that the emotion delighting us when we see the world's aspects comes to us not from its depth, but their diversity, he writes. Depth refers to the human effort to try to penetrate the mysteries of life through scientific understanding and explanation. But Camus thinks that what art does is to preserve the diversity of sensations that come from our experiences of life, which is a source of joy. While the specific experience that an artist is trying to capture may already be over, in his capturing it, he multiplies the sensations of that experience. Art itself is an absurd phenomenon. It does not offer an escape for the intellectual ailment. Rather, it is one of the symptoms of that ailment, writes Camus. We make art not to escape the absurdity of our world, but the absurdity of our world is what makes us create art. According to Camus, art makes the mind get outside of itself and places it in opposition to others, not for it to get lost, but to show it clearly the blind path that all have entered upon. This suggests that art has a transcendent quality, which makes us get out of our heads, but not to depart the world, but to view it all the more clearly. In the time of the absurd reasoning, creation follows indifference and discovery. It marks the point from which absurd passions spring and where the reasoning stops, adds Camus. A person who has come to terms with the absurdity of the world first realizes that whatever actions or paths he takes does not matter, since he is without hope and hence without goals. But in becoming the absurd person, he also realizes that it does not mean that there is nothing to do and no actions to take, but instead discovers a newfound freedom to do as he genuinely wishes, in authenticity. Artistic creation can begin when he stops trying to make sense of absurdity through his faculty of reason, but to let his passion and emotions drive him. Camus thinks that there is a false dichotomy between art and philosophy. Just like philosophy, the artist's work is attached to the artist. According to Camus, just like how a philosopher can only create one system of thought, the artist only expresses one thing but in different ways. Similar to a philosopher, the artist commits himself and becomes himself in his work. Camus thinks that the mind has a singleness of purpose, and to make a distinction when one is creating as an artist or as a thinker is a false one. He writes, "There are no frontiers between the disciplines that man sets himself for understanding and loving. They interlock and the same anxiety merges them." To create an absurd work of art, lucid thought is required, but yet in art, thought expresses itself differently. In art, reason must not be apparent, that is, reason hides itself. The work of art is born of the intelligence's refusal to reason the concrete. It marks the triumph of the carnal. It is lucid thought that provokes it, but in that very act that thought repudiates itself, writes Camus. Clear thinking is what causes one to begin creating art, but absurd art describes, and it does not try to explain or reason. Absurd art is an art in which the concrete signifies nothing more than itself. It portrays the concrete reality and does not rationalize it. The absurd artist realizes the futility of his work. The work is for itself. It is not what gives his life meaning or purpose. He realizes that whether he creates or refrains makes no difference. He does not value it. He could even repudiate it, the way French poet Rimbaud moved to Utopia and gave up his poetry. The true work of art is always on the human scale. It is essentially the one that says less, writes Camus. He contrasts a piece of writing that tries to cover all of life's experiences with one which just covers a piece of it, which, while it does not say everything, implies everything. Living is just as much experiencing as reflecting. The work then embodies an intellectual drama. The absurd work illustrates thought's renouncing of its prestige and its resignation to being no more than the intelligence that works up appearances and covers with images what has no reason, he writes. The absurd work of art captures the tension where thought has to renounce its desire to reason and understand, to instead represent with images what it cannot understand. If the world were clear, art would not exist, he surmises. At this point, Camus clarifies that he is not talking about paintings or sculptures but fictional writing. Paintings already are as he has prescribed, where the painter has to paint an image distilled from his thoughts. Camus calls it a splendid modesty since the medium of painting already forces a phenomenological representation instead of an exegesis which the medium of writing can be wont to do. Expression begins where thought ends, he writes. What is captured in the painting or music are not life's lessons, but is an emotion which gives sensation to its audience. Fictional writing as an art form, however, has a temptation to explain, to provide conclusions so that its plot can be wound up satisfactorily, though it contradicts the absurdity of the world, hence making such neat endings an illusion. To think is first of all to create a world, writes Camus. We are separated from our experiences, but we try to bridge the gulf using our previous experiences, our reason, or analogous thinking. In that way, philosophers are creators, where even Kant has in his writing his characters, his symbols, his secret action, his plot endings. As for fictional novels, such book has its logic, its reasonings, its intuition, and its postulates. Camus thinks that great novelists are those who embed philosophical ideas into their books in contrast to philosophers who write theses. According to him, the reason writers prefer using images rather than reasoned arguments is because they are convinced of the uselessness of any principle of explanation, instead believing that their message is better served through the device of description of appearances. Incapable of refining the real, thought pauses to mimic it, he adds. However, many novelists succumb to the temptation of illusion the way some thinkers have committed philosophical suicide, as Camus elaborated in the first chapter. He wants to know whether the absurd person who has accepted a life without appeal can also create without appeal, and how to achieve such freedom. The absurd attitude must be aware of its gratuitousness. The absurd person needs to know that what he does is not necessary. It has no big goal beyond its own sake. Absurd fiction needs to illustrate divorce and revolt. If it sacrifices to illusions and arouses hope, then it is no longer absurd fiction since it has a goal to give hope to its readers. Instead, absurd fiction should be an exercise in detachment and passion which crowns the splendor and futility of a man's life. The writer is driven by his passion to write, but he does so to depict the nature of our absurd condition, and not to concoct a tale to give false hope to his readers. Such writing can demonstrate that its characters live interesting lives, but it should also show how it all comes to nothing finally. However, there is a temptation in the medium of writing to explain, to judge, to provide a final illusion so as to round off the plot. The archetypes of Don Juan, the conqueror, and the play actor that Camus has laid out in the second chapter can get so involved in their ambition that they forget that their goal is to live a great life. instead becoming so entangled in their quest to conquer that they devote their efforts to acquire more and more. They are thus gods of light and idols of mud, but it is essential to find a middle path leading to the faces of man, Camus writes. Instead of accepting illusions or falling prey to existential despair, the absurd man needs to confront the reality of our condition. Philosophers that he discussed in the first chapter have made the mistake of illusion to have hope, and writers likewise can fall prey to hope. Camus examines a character, Kirilov, in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Possessed to see how faithfully Dostoevsky adheres to his absurd doctrine. Section 3.2 Kirilov. The protagonists in Dostoevsky's novels ask themselves what the meaning of life is. Dostoevsky proposes an extreme disjunction. Existence is illusory or it is eternal. However, he does not examine these two propositions as a philosopher would, instead drawing out the implications of such a dichotomy in his character's life as an artist. In Diary of a Writer, he outlines the reasoning for logical suicide. The desperate man knows through his consciousness that he cannot be happy without being in harmony with God. However, he cannot conceive that there is a God. He judges life to be a stupid comedy which is humiliating to participate in. He condemns nature, which had brought him into the world to suffer, to be annihilated along with him. In this logical suicide, he is taking revenge on the world. Kirilov suffers the same affliction. He feels that God is necessary and that he must exist, but he knows that he does not and cannot exist, explains Camus. Kirilov says, "I shall kill myself in order to assert my insubordination, my new and dreadful liberty." It is an act not of revenge but revolt. He wants to kill himself to become God. Kirilov's premise is, if God does not exist, I am God. In The Possessed, Kirilov has a fleeting thought that Jesus after dying did not end up in heaven, hence making his suffering futile. The laws of nature made Jesus live in the midst of falsehood and die for a falsehood, he notes. He is not the God who became man but the man who became God. Kirilov realizes that to be like God is to be independent. To become God is merely to be free on this earth, not to serve an immortal being, explains Camus. If God exists, all depends on him and we can do nothing against his will. If he does not exist, everything depends on us. Kirilov realizes, as Pindar, who is quoted in the epigram of the myth of Sisyphus, it is to realize on this earth the eternal life of which the gospel speaks. However, why then does Kirilov feel a need to kill himself? He says that if one can really understand the idea of being free on earth, one will live like a king, but people in general do not understand it since they cling to illusions and blind hopes. Kirilov says, man simply invented God in order not to kill himself. That is the summary of universal history down to this moment. Kirilov believes that he needs to teach them, to lead the way so that they can learn this idea. It is a pedagogical suicide. It is not despair that urges him to death but love of his neighbor for his own sake, explains Camus. As he took his life, Kirilov concludes that all is well, in an echo from Oedipus. Dostoevsky, however, makes the same mistake as the philosophers in chapter 2. In the conclusion of his books, his characters capitulate and seize on the illusion of the divine. Hence Camus says that Dostoevsky is not an absurd novelist but an existentialist one. An absurd work does not have to tie up the entire plotline with a pretty bow on top. Section 3.3 Ephemeral Creation. Camus recognizes that a reason why even Dostoevsky has failed in being the absurd man is because hope cannot be eluded forever, and that it can beset even those who wanted to be free of it. However, the potential paths to failure are what allows one to recognize the path that one needs to travel. They show how difficult it is to remain on track and the necessity of unfailing alertness. The absurd artist needs to be able to accept the futility of his efforts, to work and create for nothing, to sculpture in clay, to know that one's creation has no future, to see one's work destroyed in a day, while being aware that fundamentally this has no more importance than building for centuries, writes Camus. Negating on the one hand and magnifying on the other is the way open to the absurd creator. He must give the void its colours. To disabuse oneself of hope and yet to continue to strive is the mission of the absurd artist. He needs to show to the world the nature of our absurd human condition even if no one appreciates his work. What stops him finally is not that he has managed to convey all his ideas, to have said everything, but simply his death. What keeps the creator creating is a matter of him wanting to do it, his will. When he dies, his works, even if successful, is but a collection of failures, because he cannot enjoy his success once his life is over. Camus muses, perhaps the great work of art has less importance in itself than in the ordeal it demands of a man and the opportunity with which it provides him of overcoming his phantoms and approaching a little closer to his naked reality. In creating, it is not the success of the work, but it is the self-overcoming and self-understanding the creator gains that is his reward. Philosophical novels are inspired by rational thought which then are developed through ideas. Ideas are, however, not rational thinking. The novels perhaps prove something, but those proofs are ones that the novelists provide for themselves rather than for the world in general, surmises Camus. It is as though the writers have written their fiction to work things out for themselves, since our powers of reasoning are insufficient to work things out. Having to abandon reason since it cannot overcome the absurdity of the human condition in unifying the phenomena of life, we instead have a diversity of phenomena, which art is able to express well. Detached from our reasoning faculty, the artistic creation can then give voice to the absurd man. If the absurd artist, however, wishes to turn away, then there is no voice and no creation, but either way they are equivalent, since they make no difference as whatever striving is made comes to naught eventually. Absurd artistic creation must also bring revolt, freedom and diversity, just like absurd philosophy and the absurd man. Like the conqueror, the creator gives a shape to their fate, with their work defining who they are, just like how who they are define their work. But ultimately, it will all come to nothing. None of all this has any real meaning. In the big scheme of things, on the scale of the universe, all our efforts come to naught. Whether the creators create or refrain makes no difference. However, in recognizing the futility of life and their efforts, they are liberated to realize the work. Since success or failure makes no difference, they do their work not in pursuit of success, but for the work's sake and for their own sake, in the same way writers write their books to advance their own understanding, just as becoming aware of the absurdity of life authorized them to plunge into it with every excess. Whichever way we choose to live, life will conclude with our deaths. Other than the inevitability of death, we have freedom if we understand that this world is all we have. We lose that freedom if we subscribe to the illusion of an afterlife and all its attached reservations. Instead of renouncing the pleasures of this world in the hope of appeasing the divine, our liberated thought can flourish. It frolics, in myths to be sure, but myths with no other depth than that of human suffering, and like it, inexhaustible. Not the divine fable that amuses and blinds, but the terrestrial face, gesture and drama, in which are summed up a difficult wisdom and an ephemeral passion. We tell ourselves and one another stories, such as the philosophical fiction Camus examines, and these stories are fiction, myths, but these myths are imbued with our humanity, which captures our absurd condition and how brief our existences are, and not the kinds of illusion of the divine that deludes and chains us. I have now analysed each chapter of the myth of Sisyphus, but perhaps to round off your experience as a listener to this series, I recommend that you listen once more to the first video in the series, which talks about the preface, but also the final chapter of the book. I had begun the series with that, because I thought it was important that you have a firm understanding of what the book is about and why it is worthwhile. It gives a powerful conclusion to Camus' doctrine concerning the absurd, and why, despite our absurd condition, we, like Sisyphus, can yet be happy. Thank you. If you wish to support the Philosophical Bachelor, you can do so at worldwideweb.patreon.com/philosophicalbachelor.